You Oh, okay. I hope I don't have to repeat all that.
No, we heard.
Good enough. Okay. That's a relief. All right. What was I saying?
Pedagogical relationship.
Yeah. If you look at the relationship between students and professors, we have some traditional relationships, and they should be encouraged, and that's all good. But you also have to think about the core of our work as faculty and as administrators, which is to design things for our curriculum. That's our main product, if I can call it that. So think of a course. Now, who designs a course? Typically, a professor does. And I don't think they give a lot of thought, at least in the way they are handed a course. You join a university, you're given a course outline, you say, off you go, teach it. And they do willingly. But what if we rethink this model and say that some students working with the professor co-design the course, where students who've taken that course give input about what's working, what's not working. And so the professor is directly working with those who are obviously their main concern, and that are the learners for the course. So co-designing courses is a big part of student partnerships, as are co-researchers. A research assistant does not have to go only to collect data from the library or do some grunt work. Why not make them co-authors for papers that you're thinking about? Because we should never underestimate how brilliant some of our students are, and they have ideas. They may not be able to write in the journal that you write in, but they certainly can make contributions. And I must tell you, I've done this myself with several student partners in co-authoring articles in the best journals, and they've never disappointed me. And you can go on, co-presenters at conferences. Think about all the activities we do at the university. We have restaurants, we have places where we do functions of HR and finance and procurement. Why aren't students in those offices working side by side with our staff? And the clear answer is because we didn't really give it a priority. And yet it is such an obvious thing that many universities are rethinking that model and not just hiring students to be security guards or to pour coffee in their cups, but actually in critical thinking skills that is going to help their development. So it's like an internship. But remember, this has to be designed carefully. So when you engineer a partnership between a student and a professor, you have to have a third party mediating that. And we've done that through the LUMS Learning Institute. And we have currently over 50 partnerships in play. I'll tell you about one of those partnerships because I noted Dr. Murtaza Taj, who is from here, and his student Syed Ali Hussain. He partnered to redesign a computer graphics course to ensure maximized student learning, content coverage, and minimize student stress and plagiarism. Sub Ghumo is another successful student-teacher pedagogical partnership. It's a web-based app designed to simulate motion around black holes. And it's useful for students interested in physics, obviously, but to others as well. There's another one called Autism Assisted. I bet this must be with Sulaiman Shahid, that's a website that serves as a medium of delivery for relevant and reliable information for individuals on the autism spectrum. So anyway, I can go on and on. There are 50 of these partnerships that have taken root. I can tell you that I'm not going to be satisfied until we hit the 5,000 mark. Why 5,000? Because we have 5,000 students, and every student should be partnering in something or the other and getting on this learning curve, which I think will enrich their experience. And as far as you guys are concerned, I'm just delighted that I hope you can think broadly about speaking to some of these broader initiatives, whether they are about governance, whether they are about startups or new enterprises. You don't have to work for a bank, everyone. You can do other things too. And many students are doing just that. And then, of course, the work of partnerships, which is the 4 or 5 year experience students have with us, where this is their home and their family. And I think the best partners are those that really are treated equally as family members. I congratulate you. I thank you very much for having me here. Wish I could stay for the whole conference. I'm afraid I have a badminton match with a student who I think is going to beat the heck out of me because she's in the national championships. But I'll learn a thing or two from her, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, sir. This was quite an enlightening speech. So, something that I wish to tell you that there was something you mentioned, and you gave many examples that, but something that was really lacking was a think tank that could work on policy making, student-run think tank.
Right.
I think we filled that gap as well, and we inshallah make you proud.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I was told talk about student initiatives. So, just a few sentences about the policy and think tank that you guys are engineering. I mean, the best ideas are going to come from you. Whatever you imagine will become real. That's a quote actually from some great philosopher. I don't remember his name. But I will say this, that, before we start implementing things, before we start making interventions, we have to have frameworks. We have to have some thinking behind it. We must gather evidence to support what it is that we want to change. And we must have a very many views, which I think is what you're going to do with your think tank.
100%.
And if you're doing it with the motivation that young people have like yourselves, then I think, remember that we're the learners, you're the teachers. So keep that in mind, because often it's the other way around, and students don't find their voice because they're constantly drowned by experts who think they're better than their students. I think both have a room on the table, but the rules of the game have to be about respect and mutual recognition of what we each bring to the table. So I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. And colleagues, sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you or speak with you, but thank you for joining us. And inshallah, next time we'll have a chance to talk some more. And when you do come to LUMS, please pay me a visit, and I'd be glad to host you. And you don't have to ride my motorcycle when you come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please accept this as a token of appreciation.
Oh, it would be my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Right. So that being said, I think we should move on towards the panel discussion. Before that, the LUMS Policy Research Institute is basically a think tank that wants to critique various policies in Pakistan, national level policies, such as education, foreign policy, national security. And I think that's the reason why we have this second panel on foreign policy in the context of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which is quite a pertinent problem right now in Pakistan, especially considering the fact that the Prime Minister paid a visit to Russia amid the chaos and the crisis. So I'll start off by introducing the panelists. So we have 4 esteemed panelists on board today with us. One of them is not here yet, but he's going to be here shortly. So we'll start off with, we'll start off with Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed. Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed is one of the most renowned academics in Pakistan. He is a political scientist and a historian, having authored numerous books on the history and politics of Pakistan. So the most recent addition in his list was Jinnah, his successes, failures, and role in history, which really cleared a number of misconceptions regarding the origins of Pakistan over here. But apart from that, he has a huge following on his YouTube channel, where he regularly uploads videos on contemporary issues such as history, international relations, so on and so forth. And currently he is a professor emeritus of political science at Stockholm University in Sweden. So thank you so much, sir, for blessing us with your presence. Next, we have Mr. Ahmed Bilal Sufi. He's not here, but he, like I said before, joining us shortly. He's one of the most prominent lawyers in Pakistan and abroad. He was the former federal minister for law, justice, parliamentary affairs, and human rights during the 2013 caretaker government. In 1993, he founded the Research Society of International Law, which is one of its kind in Pakistan. So he's considered and authority in international law. Next, we have with us Barrister Taimur Malik. Mr. Taimur is the founder of Quoting the Law, Pakistan's first legal analysis portal. Moreover, he has also served as the executive director at the Research Society of International Law and is currently a partner at Clive & Company, which is one of the most prominent global law firms. He is regularly invited to legal discussions in Pakistan, where he is considered an authority on legal issues. Finally, we have with us Dr. Hussain Nadeem, who is the executive director at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. He has a MPhil degree in international relations from the University of Cambridge, while a PhD in government from the University of Sydney. In 2016, he was named in Forbes 30 under 30 list for his work in law and policy. And there is something that I want to put out over here. Our idea of LUMS Policy Research Institute has heavily been influenced by Islamabad Policy Research Institute and the work that it has done in the past 2 years. So it's really a fan moment having Dr. Hussain Nadeem over here with us. So yeah, so the talk will be moderated by Ms. Mariam Kiani. Ms. Mariam is an Islamabad-based journalist, researcher, and podcast host. Her work with a digital media platform called the Pakistan Now has been on topics of international relations, Pakistan's foreign policy, and society and gender. She graduated from LUMS with a degree in history in 2021. So with that being said, Mariam, over to you.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Hamza. Am I audible? If I'm audible to the people at the seminar and to the guests as well?
Yes, yes.
Right. Really, thank you, Hamza, and to LUMS Policy Research Institute for organizing this and for the panelists for taking out a time today. And the conversation is essentially going to be about the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And in that, we're going to begin with the crisis itself, a bit about an understanding of it via a lens of international relations and a bit about international law. And then we're going to devote the larger part of the conversation perhaps on Pakistan's foreign policy. Towards the end of it, we'll have, I believe, 15 minutes devoted to the question and answer session. So that's when the audience can kind of send in their questions and we'll kind of, hope the panelists to answer those. I think I could perhaps begin the conversation with just trying to, for the audience, sketch a bit about what really is happening, of course, in a very oversimplified way, because there's only so much that can be said in a few minutes. And then I'd like to hand it over to the panelists to give their assessment and then to further talk about specific areas of inquiry. So perhaps if we were to look back at the crisis a few years back, perhaps in the 1990s, which is when the Soviet Republic falls apart and you have Ukraine, which is your former Soviet Republic, emerge out as then the third largest atomic arsenal of the world. And you see then Russia and US try to denuclearize this country, and it is done. And then it's Ukraine becomes a non-nuclear country on the premise that Russia will protect its security and against any invasion and so on. And then this is challenged, I believe, first time into 2014, which is when Russia invades Crimea. And that happens around the context of a government, which is a pro-Russia government in Ukraine that is ousted and a pro-Western president is put into place. And so perhaps that's where then the situation kind of begins to get tense for Russia and for Putin, where he begins to see Ukraine as a buffer zone of sorts, whose security and whose political alliances kind of determine then Russia's security. And that is essentially the thing that we're seeing now, which is that Putin sees Putin sees Ukraine as very central to his vision of Russia's security and of the control. And so when Ukraine now kind of decides to show allegiances with the NATO or EU or show the desire to want to be a part of them, Russia feels threatened. In that now what you're seeing essentially is a lot of Russian troop deployment across Ukrainian borders. You're seeing attacks and bombing. You're seeing now the West and the European Union and the NATO respond with sanctions. And of course, within that, you have divide within the European Union countries as well. And of course, you see a big refugee and humanitarian crisis. So this is just, of course, a very, very oversimplification that I am very aware of that, is just a sort of a sketch of the situation as of now. I think I would like Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed to kind of, begin with his assessment of the situation and what he thinks is where the situation is leading now. What does he think Putin wants out of it? Will there will be further escalation of war, or will there be the attempts of diplomacy or a ceasefire successful?
Thank you very much. I would like to begin first by thanking wholeheartedly the LUMS Foreign Policy Research Institute and congratulate them for coming into being. I'm sure a lot of knowledge and theoretical and empirical will flow out of this initiative. So this is a great addition to LUMS academic capabilities. I had the privilege of teaching there for 2 years, so I really understand that LUMS is a leading educational institution of Pakistan. Now, I think Mariam Ahmed has very well, in a pithy manner, presented the background to this conflict. I, being basically a political scientist, must dare to put some theoretical input into how I look at the situation. And I would say that the Russian-Ukraine conflict is a typical example of the discrepancy between the UN Charter, which presupposes the equality of all states, including their sovereign right to decide freely their domestic and foreign policies. Considering that vast parts of the world before the UN Charter and the United Nations were under colonial rule, and the Charter set in motion decolonization, the declaration of all states as equal members of the international community was an unprecedented ideal. It represented, I think there are two main schools or perspectives to understand how states behave in the international context. One is liberal internationalism, where cooperation is of the essence, and realism, the contrasting position, where each state fends for itself, lives in fear of all others, and that results in military alliances, wars, conflicts, balance of power disturbances, and so on. The UN Charter was based on international liberalism and was based on another assumption, which is social democracy, because the United Nations was to serve as a basis for stimulating development in the underdeveloped parts of the world. So it was premised on cooperation. However, from the outset, realpolitik reflected another reality. The asymmetries of power in the international system, which gave powerful states, especially superstates, a great advantage in imposing their will on other states. Ideological, security, and economic interests generated anarchy in world politics. That situation persisted even when the Cold War in principle ended after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the New World Order, NATO expansion continued eastward despite Russia no longer posing the threat it did previously. I mean, this is what all of them were agreed. Considered in this light, while the recent conflict is an example of a powerful neighbor imposing its will on a weaker one, its motivations for doing so also require us to understand them. The Russian Federation feels encircled and beleaguered by NATO, with the European Union siding with NATO, not consistently, but mostly. And that accentuates acute sense of insecurity or existentialist threat that the powerful neighbor has developed. I need not labor the point, but just to put things in context, because most of you are so young, you don't know how this world has been in the last century and then now, Such concerns are deeply rooted in its historical experiences, of Russia, since the invasion of Napoleon and the great suffering it went through during World War I and especially World War II. Let me underline this, that during World War II, of the 50 million people killed in the European theater, 27 million were only Soviet citizens. And that's a horrific amount of casualties and fatalities to bear for a nation. So if now such a state is engaged in an invasion of a neighboring country, under no circumstance we can justify it. But we have to understand what drove it to such a desperate action. Just to show you that this is very arbitrary in international politics, this sense of an existentialist threat, we can mention a comparable case of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Cuba had Russian missiles stationed on its territory, and President Kennedy threatened a world war unless the missiles were removed. Then we have the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which caused more than 1 million deaths, the destruction of which the UN Secretary General described as unlawful. So what has happened now is, in one way, a repetition of things which have happened elsewhere and under the leadership of the United States. The destruction of Libya in 2011, the bombing of Vietnam, which killed 3 million poor peasants, none of them actually constitute in any rational manner an existentialist threat to the United States. And yet, the Americans went forward and carried out these criminal activities. One must also admit that the Soviet Union also used force to quell rebellions within the Warsaw Pact countries. Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia were subjected to Russian intervention, but the casualties and fatalities comparably were much less. Now, if we look at the voting in the United Nations General Assembly, I think all these experiences are with the world. The European states voted collectively against, in favor of the resolution which previously had been presented in the Security Council, and those of Asia and Africa and Latin America abstained in large numbers, 35 altogether. Among those which abstained were not only Pakistan and India or China, but also Iran, Iraq, South Africa, Vietnam, Laos, and many others. Venezuela and Latin America even voted against the resolution. Each had its own experiences of Western machinations. Considered in the light of this background, one can only deeply regret and condemn the loss of life and the destruction that has followed of Ukraine. While Putin surely must be blamed for waging a war which has caused heart-wrenching suffering to the Ukrainian people, which he has not won quickly and brought about a regime change. So here is a problem for Putin. His decision to invade Ukraine is still not fully realized. What has happened is 2.5 million refugees are already on the move, and up to 5 million are expected to move out of Ukraine in search of safe havens. Poland and Germany are likely to be the main recipients. Sweden is preparing to receive some 200,000. There is no doubt that there is great sympathy for the refugees, especially because they are mostly women and children. Whereas when the Syrian war took place, most people who came were young men, So that's a difference. And then, of course, the ethnic and cultural, relationship between Ukrainians and European civilization need to be understood as well. Regarding the question of a ceasefire, I would say that I was relieved that President Zelensky came out with a statement, saying that he is willing to forego NATO membership, as well as willing to give up, as well as he is willing to discuss the independence of the Russian-dominated 2 provinces which have been declared as states by Russia. Had he done this before the conflict started, this misery and this suffering on the people could have been avoided, but he didn't. Probably misunderstood, misread the intentions of the West and especially of the Americans. Whether multilateral structures will help, bring this terrible conflict to an end, or the 2, parties would manage to do it on their own, remains to be seen. But what I know is that Putin has been in touch with President Erdogan, who hosted a meeting between foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine. Today, Finland's president talked to Putin. So Putin is willing to talk to many people, including President Macron of France. So there must be some willingness to agree to a ceasefire. Pakistan's foreign policy. Pakistan abstained from voting against Russia, both in the Security Council as well as in the United Nations General Assembly, invoking the indivisibility of security, which means that Ukraine cannot enhance its security by jeopardizing the security of Russia. I think this was a fairly convincing, cogent reason for Pakistan to vote. But then Pakistan's own past complicates Pakistan's position to act freely.
Dr. Ishtiaq, if I could interrupt you here, perhaps about the foreign policy, we can talk separately towards a later part of the discussion. Yeah. So when we kind of.
Okay, I didn't know whether I should do it all as one, presentation or in pieces. Anyhow, no, I stop here. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. No, thank you very much for your reflection on how we've seen, in the past also such behaviors happen by nation states, and then what it means in terms of a multilateral world and in understanding, this situation as well. So thank you for that. I'd like now Dr. Hussain Nadeem to kind of briefly give his assessment of the situation, what it could look like in the coming week or months, and also, briefly talk about if the question of Zelensky joining NATO, or if that assurance that Russia wants really badly will be given, and if diplomacy, you think, in your opinion, is going to succeed this time.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Mariam. And I'd like to start by thanking the host of this seminar, and also congratulate the LUMS Policy Research Institute for setting up this very important think tank. Part of the reason why I think it's very important is because despite the fact that Islamabad is only around 350 kilometers from Lahore, it's very much disconnected from the academia, the research, the policy institutes, and the rest of the country. So this is very important initiative for a university like LUMS to be able to not only set up, but have its first event linked with a think tank like Islamabad Policy Research Institute. And we look forward to having more cooperation. Part of the reason why I say that is also because I do think that having been recruiting the students for the last 10 years in the government, I do see a particular disconnect of academia with the actual policy concerns in Pakistan and even the priorities. So it's very important initiative, and I wish you guys luck, and I'm more than happy to help you take this to where you want to take it. Now, as far as the crisis in Russia goes, let me just put on my policy and academic hat. Dr. Ishtiaq has already given a very sophisticated understanding from a theoretical background on looking at the background of the crisis and where does it, what options are there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to break it down from a more policy perspective with a little bit of hint on theory as well. My main focus in the government, in the policy sector, is basically I use data for national security and foreign policy, which in other words mean I do a lot of game theory, which again means that I have to develop scenario A, scenario B, scenario D, and figuring out exactly what the current situation will be, what will be the options, and what will be the options specific for Pakistan. I'll talk about the Pakistan's foreign policy later, as Mariam has already mentioned. There's a separate section for that. But to give just the analysis on the whole crisis, there's very interesting book by Lao Tzu. It's called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And it starts off with this one very important line that the empires long divided must unite, long united must divide. So it essentially talks about how three different states in pre-era China essentially were rising and falling. They were uniting, they were deconstructing. So that is very important to understand the current situation. Part of the reason is because we continue to talk about the post-colonial world. If anything, the recent crisis has shown, and the conversations and the discourses that have come out, including pressurizing Pakistan and India and other underdeveloped states, is that we're not living in a post-colonial world. The colonial, it's very much present. It's a colonial present. The effects are there. The imperialism, the discourses, the narrative, the otherization, the prejudice. I mean, we've done a lot of data from our institute on just how, for instance, Israel-Palestine crisis was covered by New York Times and The Guardian. And you'd be surprised how much of these supposedly objective media houses toe the national government's line, the Western line. This Ukraine crisis also reveal a lot in terms of this whole architecture of the world. So I'll start off by establishing a framework. The framework to understand is essentially you need to understand the decolonization and post-colonialism. So to understand the whole geopolitical analysis, we need to understand that none of this is new. This has been ongoing for the last 100 to 300 years. The same actors, Russia, Germany, US, UK, Europe, over and over again, from the World War I to the World War II to what we are facing right now, throughout the Cold War as well. So that's one European affairs. Part of the reason I can talk in very much detail of why that is the case, I still think that one of the fundamental mistakes that are there in the Western societies and the Western academia is they have institutionalized war as part of their academia, as part of their policy-making circuits. I mean, for the last 30, 40 years, just before that, the Ministry of Defense in the UK was actually Ministry of War. So when you institutionalize war into your official policy-making narrative and official policy-making, what you get eventually is a war. So we need to understand that the society, the Western society specifically, is based on very thick Hobbesian, Clausewitzian model, where there is a zero-sum game, that either you get it or I get it. There is no in the middle. So while we do talk about the liberal world order and all of that, what we do still have a very, very strong semblance of a realist world, which still subscribe to, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry to say this, but 14th century ideas. In a world which is powered by artificial intelligence, digital technologies, data, the unfortunate thing is that the policy world is still very much inspired by theories that are probably not that important in this day and age. Yet they have been forced down through institutionalized structures. And hence what we see right now, the problem in the US foreign policy is essentially that it's still living in a Cold War era, despite of the fact that, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Ishtiaq Sahib, that Russia was not a threat. But yet, because you had trained a generation of Russian experts, the Cold War thinking, as soon as anything emerges, the same individuals, the same academics, the same media houses knows nothing else but to essentially create monsters out of things that they don't understand. So Putin in the Western language will always remain a monster. Anybody who does not subscribe to a specific Western model of democracy or Western liberal ideology is otherized. So post-colonialism is a very important element to understand how the West thinks and how they have approached this war. So I will not go on into commenting specifically on who started what, because this issue goes centuries back. And there is no really point on talking about whether Russia is right or that is right. But the truth on ground is that post-colonialism still very much is under the only lens that I see to understand this. Now, the second thing is also because post-colonialism gives us only one sense of the overall architecture of the geopolitics and the war. We also need to look at this from a hybrid war perspective from the fifth generation. What we're seeing right now is that this battle is being fought at two levels. One is the military operations side on the ground, where Russia is winning. The other is the information side of the war, the battle of ideas and the battle of the narratives, where there is a total Western monopoly right now. So it's very interesting if you look at that. If you scan through social media, if you scan through any Twitter, Facebook and all, it appears that Russia is facing tremendous losses and Russia is being defeated. The brave Ukrainian and the brave president is coming as the leader of the Western world, the democracy and all. And yet when you go a little bit deeper into the information and use other outlets, you'll realize that Russia is essentially being able to meet its military objectives. In the first very 3 days, Russia was able to obliterate the entire Ukrainian military deployments on its borders. Right now, Russia has taken control of much of the Ukrainian major cities. So one thing we need to do as an analyst is to be very much cognizant of our own confirmation bias. Fortunately or unfortunately, Pakistan is an English-speaking country. Our elite is very westernized. So we continue to use CNN and BBC as our own primary sources. What we've noticed in the past couple of days that we need to diversify as somebody who sits in the policy side, I don't have the luxury to just look at one sources. So I have to talk to the people in Russia. I have to talk to the Russian policymakers, the Chinese, to understand exactly what's going on. It's straightforward at the moment that the situation on ground is very, very, it's deplorable. There are refugees on the ground. There are humanitarian crises going on. Russia is essentially there. It has currently an edge on the domestic front. And yet on the information side, on the ideas side, I think it's the West that has been able to not only unify the Europe, but also being able to have that sort of upper edge in terms of the morality. We can discuss and debate a lot about the Western morality, because I do think that this Ukrainian crisis has, if anything, exposed Western hypocrisy on its human rights agenda, on exactly what is and what isn't terrorism, what is and what isn't right in the international politics. So these are some things that I do think are very important to look at when we look at the Ukrainian-Russia crisis. Now, coming to the last leg of this, that what to expect out of it. Many things, actually. But first, we need to understand the Russian mindset and the Russian expectations out of this. These crises did not happen overnight. They were a buildup for the last 2 decades. Russia was one of the most sanctioned countries since 2004. After 2014, it was even more sanctioned. Did the sanctions really work? No. It's impossible for the sanctions to work given the Russian and the European reliance on the Russian trade and the Russian oil. So that's that one element there. The second important element on that front is basically to understand that what are the objectives of Russia? Is Russia interested to take over Ukraine, colonize it, and install its puppet regime over there? Or is Russia more interested in bargaining from a position of very strong military ground dominance? I think that would be the Russian interest to essentially bring the country to a point and achieve 2 military objectives. One, root out the military deployments that were there for the last decade or so, the very silent militarization of the borderlands between Ukraine and Russia. So that has been neutralized. Now comes the diplomacy part. And as Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed has already mentioned, that Putin has demonstrated his interest in talking to different countries in the region and different powers to discuss what's the way out. For the British and for the Europeans, I think there are two different elements to this thing. I mean, what we're seeing right now is that there is Europe and then there is US. Both have very different interests in this war. For the European countries, they don't want to topple over the Russian regime, the Putin regime. What they do want is figuring out a way to exit the crisis, giving Putin some face value, face saving, as well as not being able to have the entire situation up in flames, partly because of the refugee issues and because of the other issues that might be there. Now, on the US side, the foreign policy interests are very different. The US does not really care about the Ukrainian refugee crisis. It has more interest, if you look at the language and the discourses coming out, it's more interested in the regime change. The messaging right from the top of the US government to the very low at the State Department level is essentially talking about the need for a regime change in Russia. So those are two very different messaging coming out. From the other power perspective, when we look at China, China has had a very interesting and a very hard position to take, because it has very deep ties with Russia, and yet China has stood with the Ukraine for its sovereignty and all of that as well. I can talk more about that in detail, but China has continued to be in somewhere in the middle of these two different crises, because it cannot jeopardize its relations with the Western powers, as well as it does not want to jeopardize its relations with Russia. So it is one of the most difficult situations, and I think this issue naturally, if continues to prolong, which I don't think will prolong more than 2 weeks, because that does not suit the interests of President Putin. By the end of March, we're looking that there will be more clarity on the issue, and I think it should be over by then. But if things continue to go on for more weeks into April, then China will be forced to take a position, and I think that will go south for China. I'm going to stop over here from the geopolitical perspective, but just to give a roundup, use a post-colonial framework to understand the larger geopolitical context, and then use the hybrid model of understanding the current battlefield, which is both the information side and the military side. And I think that will provide us some semblance of understanding on how the Putin would like to fight this war. Because if you look at one very tiny thing, Russia is one of the best when it comes to its disinformation and information warfare. Yet throughout this entire battle, Russia was completely absent on the information domain, which tells us one very important thing, that the Russian objectives were not a moral victory. They had a military operations, military interests, which is why they didn't bother with the information side. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. Nadeem, this helps. I mean, of course, it's a very important angle that you've presented in terms of trying to understand, through an imperialist lens, perhaps, or a post-colonial lens, how a lot of what continues to happen in the world today, in terms of the prejudices that you talked about. I remember there was a week right after the invasion when we had clips come out from European and Western media channels, very senior officials speaking about how it's the European lives are being lost, and this is not Afghanistan, or this is not uncivilized, and to see, and that in itself is a show of how there's great prejudice and there's great warfare that goes on in forms of discourses that are also talked about, whose lives matter more than other lives. And of course, as heartbreaking as that is, it's just something that we're now seeing very openly happen, and not that we've not seen it in the past as well. And that's where I'd like Taimur, Malik Sahib to kind of help us better understand this idea of an international order, of international law, of perhaps another thing that happened is how there was a lot of talk by anti-war organizations and campaigners that talked about the need of NATO in this time. Okay, why do we even need this organization anymore, given that it was built for a very different purpose? And more than that, in terms of just international law, international treaties, how do you see that kind of tie in with what's happening if international law is being used, say, by certain leaders like Putin to kind of expose US hypocrisy and then continue with their war? Or do you think international law has any adequacy left to kind of mitigate crises like these? And then what is your assessment? Sorry for that kind of long. I hope that's not too many questions, however you want to take it. Yeah.
Ji, Mariam, thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Mariam, to you for moderating this. And thank you to Dr. Ishtiaq and Dr. Hussain for some very interesting points that have been raised so far. मैं उन बातों को repeat नहीं करूँगा. I would start by saying that those of you who've studied international relations would have heard that there are no permanent friends or enemies. in international relations only interests, right? जब हम international law की भी बात करते हैं तो I think it's, or as lawyers I think that's even more so the case. Their only interests that one needs to look after. जो अब हम दुनिया जिसमें रह रहे हैं, I as Hussain knows, I like to say कि we are not hopefully living in the era of warfare, although Putin is proving us wrong, but rather in the era of lawfare and perhaps economic warfare. Or you should read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. What we are seeing now is perhaps economic warfare by states. So Russia के केस में जो हुआ है, some of the most significant actions by the West have not just been sanctioning organizations and individuals, but MasterCard और Visa अगर आप इस्तेमाल नहीं कर सकते और Apple Pay यूज नहीं कर सकते रशिया के अंदर, आपके लॉ फर्म्स और इंटरनेशनल ऑडिट फर्म्स और इंटरनेशनल कंसल्टेंसी फर्म्स ने अपने दफ्तर बंद कर दिए हैं रशिया के अंदर. So these are all ways of fighting a particular regime using tools which are available to you. अब इसमें लॉ के बहुत सारे डायमेंशन हैं. लॉ के डायमेंशन सिर्फ नेटो वाला नहीं है. नेटो के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से ऑब्वियसली आई थिंक रशिया का एक पर्सपेक्टिव एक किस्म का लीगल रिजीम रिलेटेड था कि जी दे डोंट वांट यूक्रेन टू बी पार्ट ऑफ नेटो. दे डोंट वांट द अदर स्टेट्स नेबरिंग रशिया टू कम इन द फोल्ड ऑफ नेटो बिकॉज दे फील कि अगर वो हो गया तो to the NATO member states would be duty bound to protect them and in fact may have frontline machinery and armed forces and capabilities close to Russian borders. So उस हद तक तो लगता है कि जो इस तरह के इंटरनेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन हैं उनके लीगल स्ट्रक्चर्स हैं वो कुछ हद तक चलते हैं और उनको ऑब्वियसली रशिया भी मानता है अभी तक. So from that point of view this move is pretty much against a particular legal order चला है. और अब ये लग रहा है कि जैसे रशिया में succeed in achieving its objectives in terms of Ukraine or others not joining it. So कुछ तो ये बात होगी. Generally जो international law के critics हैं वो यही बात करते हैं कि international law like any law without sanction उसकी वक़्त कितनी है. So United Nations की कोई अपनी आर्मी नहीं है तो वो enforce कैसे करेंगे. आपकी लोकल जुडिशरी कोई ऑर्डर देती है तो वो पुलिस का इस्तेमाल कर सकती है कि जी जाके आप उसको इन्फोर्स करें. हमने पैलेस्टाइन वॉल का देखा है. आईसीजे में बहुत केस हुआ आज से 15 साल पहले 17 साल पहले और एडवाइजरी ओपिनियन आया कि जी वॉल इलीगल है लेकिन उसके ऊपर कोई रोकथाम नहीं हो सकी. इसी तरह हम कश्मीर की बात करते हैं उस पर बहुत सारी रेजोल्यूशन हैं कि राइट ऑफ सेल्फ डिटर्मिनेशन के ऊपर वोटिंग के लिए भी लेकिन कुछ नहीं हुआ. इंडिया ने डोमेस्टिक लॉज में यूनिलैटरल चेंजेस लेके आ गए और इंटरनेशनल लीगल रिजीम कुछ नहीं कर सके. अब यहाँ पे रशिया अपने और रशिया के जो एलाइज हैं या जो साइड लाइन पे बैठे हुए मेंबर स्टेट्स हैं वो भी इंटरनेशनल लॉ और इन चीज़ों को अपने पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से भी यूज़ कर रही हैं. रशिया इज अ परमानेंट मेंबर स्टेट ऑफ द यूनाइटेड नेशन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल. आपने वीटो का उसमें एक वोट रखा हुआ है कि कोई चीज़ अप्रूव ही नहीं हो सकती. तो वो रशिया भी वहाँ मौजूद है. तो हाउ वुड a UN Security Council approve a decision which is not aligned with Russia's interests? तो उससे हमें कुछ ये समझ आती है कि जी जो इंटरनेशनल ऑर्डर है as it stands today that cannot work moving forward. और यूनाइटेड नेशंस की रिफॉर्म की बहुत बात पहले हुई है कि वो किस तरह का रिफॉर्म होना चाहिए. इंडिया वांट्स टू बिकम अ मेंबर स्टेट बट हम दुनिया के आबादी के और साइज के हिसाब से भी बड़े 7-8 मुल्कों में आप शामिल होते हैं, बांग्लादेश भी और इंडोनेशिया भी. सो क्या ये पॉसिबल है कि आप मुसलमान ममालिक में से तो किसी को परमानेंट स्टेट ही ना दें, सीट ही ना दें और से ना दें और वैसे आप इंक्रीज करते जाएं मेंबरशिप. बट इवन अदरवाइज warfare cannot be done now in isolation of lawfare. So आपकी एविएशन की बात हो, आपकी फ्रीडम ऑफ मूवमेंट्स की बात हो, आपकी फ्रीडम ऑफ गुड्स की बात हो, आपके ये जो पेमेंट गेटवेज थे, पेमेंट प्लेटफॉर्म्स हैं, इन सब की बात हो, ये सब एक इंटरनेशनल कॉन्ट्रैक्चुअल रिजीम्स के तहत चल. और जो इस वक्त एट प्ले है वो सब कुछ खाली टैंकों के यूक्रेन में जाने की बात नहीं है, यू नो एवरीथिंग एल्स इज आल्सो एट प्ले। जहाँ तक पाकिस्तान की पॉलिसी की बात है उस पर आगे बात करेंगे। मैं सिर्फ शुरू में ये सिलसिले में ये कहना चाहूँगा कि फॉरेन पॉलिसी भी अब आइसोलेशन में नहीं देखी जा सकती। आपके जो फॉरेन पॉलिसी इंटरेस्ट हैं बिल्कुल आप को देखेंगे, आप ये नहीं देखेंगे कि वेस्ट आपसे क्या चाहता है, बट थोड़ा सा आपको ये ज़रूर देखना होगा कि आपके इंटरनेशनल लीगल ऑब्लिगेशंस क्या हैं और क्या आपकी फॉरेन जो पॉलिसी फॉरेन रिलेशंस पोजीशन है कि वो आपको किसी और मुश्किल में तो नहीं डाल देगी। एंड आई लुक फॉरवर्ड टू डिस्कसिंग इट लेटर। ओवर टू यू मैम।
Sorry, I was unable to unmute myself. I didn't have permission. Right. Thank you, Taimur Malik Sahib, for that. I think आपने एक बात की कि the world order that we're in right now, उसमें states need to look at their interests more than who they're aligning with, or having that one best friend of sorts. But what we do see happening in this is a lot of Cold War behavior, which is a shock in some ways, because you do see Putin and Biden behaving in ways that are very similar to earlier before a time of perhaps a balance of power. And in that I want to understand how Pakistan understands all of it. If we are from a foreign policy perspective, I think we can now go back to Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, and he can be the first one to comment on this now. If you think Pakistan is able to balance the West and kind of Russia, US, and also China's relationship with Russia, what that means, and then or will camp politics of some sort will be inevitable in situations like these, do you think?
अब उर्दू में बात करनी है या अंग्रेजी में, ये दोनों आप
जिसमें भी आप करिए, whatever you want.
चले, what is in Pakistan's best interest? I think my colleagues would agree, and the students as well. It is a common place to say that Pakistan must fix its priorities in a rational manner instead of getting bogged down by ideological objectives. Pakistan's problem has been that it has never been able to decide in a rational manner what is it in its best interest. Partly this derived from the way Pakistan was created at the time of the partition. The border in West Pakistan was so close to the Indian border that from day one, security became a major concern of Pakistan. And if you then look at East Pakistan, which was so far away, we never really had any preparation to defend them against aggression. So in such circumstances, Pakistan entered into its series of dependencies. First with the Americans, and who really benefited out of it? I would like to have my colleagues even shed light on this, because I've written a book on this, Pakistan, the Garrison State. Of course, we received military aid and economic aid and so on, but finally, Pakistan paid a very heavy price by being forced into the frontline state character when the war in Afghanistan was going on. Pakistan's peaceful society was brutalized. Pakistan's involvement in that war created all sorts of extremisms, and Pakistan has still not been able to extricate from that commitment. I would say that maybe this is important to underline that since both Pakistan and India abstained from voting in favor of this resolution, how are the two affected? I think Pakistan is too dependent on the economic and financial interests that we have vis-a-vis the West. So that makes us very vulnerable. Our trade, our development funds and so on with FATF imposed, and the Americans have punished us with a $55 million penalty on the National Bank of Pakistan. All these are indicative of the old, position of great powers to impose their will on unwilling members. So Pakistan is a victim of it. As compared to this, India kept out of bloc politics, and although it has also voted like Pakistan, Pentagon, I heard one of their spokespersons saying that we understand India's position because it is heavily dependent on its arms coming from the Russians, but that the Indians have promised to diversify the supply of arms. So India is not going to be taken to task the same way as we have been taken to task up until now. I would say that we must return to South Asia. We are part of South Asia and we should build our security architecture within this region. Let me once again dare to point out two political theory positions. Cooperation among states can come through the Hobbesian fear of invasion from a powerful neighbor. That's one. But it is also motivated by the Lockean idea of cooperation leading to prosperity and peace. I think Pakistan is already committed to this framework through SAARC. And one way that India, Pakistan, I would say even China can be motivated to sort out their problems is to convince them that we together as Asian people with a long history of colonial exploitation have more in common than the vain nationalist conflicts that we are facing currently. So I would hope that within Pakistan, instead of ideology, a rational reassessment of our position in South Asia is undertaken. And we sort out our problems with India, provided India is willing. I mean, it takes two to play tango, that's correct. But I'm sure there is a realization on both parts that this is badly needed. I would give you the example of this Indian missile coming and hitting Mia Chunnu. I was very pleased that General Babar Iftikhar took a very, measured position and said that this could be just some malfunctioning of technology on the part of the Indians. And so we will wait until India comes up with its own explanation. And then the Indians responded by acknowledging that this truly was a case of malfunctioning of technology. And it was not meant to catch Pakistan off guard. All these jingoistic people are making very strange claims. I think we need a rational level of grasping the point that, given that there is an international border between India and Pakistan where the margin of error is so little that if accidentally a war were to break out between India and Pakistan, there would be devastation on both sides. So this missile thing, I hope, leads to rethinking, reassessment in the capitals at Islamabad and Delhi. I think South Asia is being held hostage by India, Pakistan's vain nationalist conflicts over Kashmir, over so many other things. It's like zero-sum games being played all the times, and the consequent arms race which follows. Where does China come in? I don't think Pakistan should entirely put all its eggs in one basket. For example, we don't know what the CPEC agreements really are. How much does Pakistan draw advantage of from these projects which are underway? A diversified Pakistan's economy would be more in our interest than just leaving one bloc and once again joining another bloc. China would act in its own interest, as Dr. Hussain, Nadeem pointed out. And as we know, international law is simply a fiction which states break all the time, as Taimur Malik has underlined. So Pakistan's best national interest is served by making South Asia a zone of peace. I think I will end here.
Right, thank you for that. Dr. Hussain, Nadeem, would you like to now kind of comment on Pakistan's foreign policy and how do you understand Pakistan's stance on the conflict?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed has very well articulated some of very important points. And I think there are a lot of students here. I do encourage them to read his book, The Garrison State. I read it myself, and I also took a lot of inspiration from that during my PhD as well. So starting from that, while I do agree with most of the things that have been said by Dr. Ishtiaq, I'm going to start right from there as well. There is this conversation when this recent Ukraine crisis happened, and before that, the Prime Minister visited Russia. The Western analyst community in DC specifically was very activist in its criticism over Pakistan. One of the criticism that was there, which caught my eye, was the fact that Pakistan does not know its national interest. It does not know what it's doing. It is making a mistake. And we, as the friends of Pakistan, would like to warn Pakistan that this is not a good time, the bad optics. These were some of the words that were used. And I understand what Dr. Ishtiaq is saying is not from that lens, but I want to talk a little bit about this notion of Pakistan's national interest and who defines it, whether we're following the national interest or not. And I'm gonna wear my academic hat because I'm not representing any government or policy institute or anything right now. This is more in the academic hat right now. I've only worked in the public sector in Pakistan, focusing on national security and policy, and it's been over 11 years. And because I have an academic background, I've had experiences of both sides, looking at from the academic lens and from the policy lens. I do think that there is an over-exaggeration, and I think it's also misconstructed when we talk about, specifically when the Western analysts talk about that somehow Pakistan does not know what its national interest is. I do agree. In many ways, yes. Pakistan's national interest is probably not articulated, but the reason of that is not because Pakistan is unable to do that, or the competency isn't there, or that there's somehow lacking of intellect, as the Western analysts continue to believe that anyone outside of the US without a US PhD is perhaps not intellectual enough to comment on stuff. So they become more expert on our lives than our own people. So I think the caveat, the minor thing over here we need to notice is that it's not that Pakistan was not able to pursue its national interest. The people who were in power, and if you read Dr. Ishtiaq's book, he talks very effectively about the post-independence, this Praetorian oligarchy that emerged in Pakistan. You see, what Pakistan is right now for the last, since 1947, is there is an elite capture of the state by certain power centers. They have followed their national interest, their institutional interest, their personal interest, their private interest very effectively. They have been very competent in their businesses. They have been very competent in their personal interests. Yet somehow, when it comes to the national interest, that has been at the expense of their private and the interest. So I don't want to give those people, strip them of their agency. I mean, we continue to say that, oh, Pakistan has failed because we had incompetent leaders. Absolutely not. We've had excellent and competent leaders who have been very, very effective in their private businesses and their personal wells and all of that. And yet somehow when it comes to the national interest, that's never been there. So I do want to bring a little bit nuance on the fact that the reason why national interests have not been articulated is by design. It's there because the vacuum of that then allows the power groups, the mafias, as like Prime Minister likes to say, to then be able to make the way for their personal interest to come on the surface. And I think the book itself by Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed talks very heavily on that. And there are other authors that wrote a little bit about how the elite capture has worked. So one on that. Now, to come on exactly the Pakistan's foreign policy, and I think that's one area that I really enjoy working on, and I've done a lot of research on this subject as well. Pakistan has a very, very interesting, one of the most fascinating ways of how Pakistan actually bargains and negotiates in the foreign policy domain with the Western powers. There is a saying that goes in Punjab, and I'm sure rest of the Pakistan as well, कि मजलूम के साथ अल्लाह ताला होता है, that the God is with the weak. You look at the beggars on the roadside, and when they come and ask you for money outside hospitals and all, they do play that very strong card that Allah Ta'ala, they use the religious connotations and all of that. So this whole idea that God is with the weak, if you look at closely, that specific idea is inherently the core policy of the national security establishment, that they bargain from the position of relative weakness. And the reason why they're able to do that, because our parts of the world, the East where we live, inspired by the Buddhism, the Jainism, and the Hinduism, our idea, and Chanakya and these other local political scientists, our idea of strong and weak is very different from the ideas and the theoretical definition of strong and weak that are there in the Western world. Because in the West, the idea is that what is strong? A country with a particular GDP based on military power, the economic power, the information power and all. Yet when you look at that empire, those power in the context of Afghanistan warfare, you'll realize that a group of 25,000 people wearing Peshawari chappals and holding World War II era guns were able to overcome the empire. So the idea of strong and weak is very different when it comes to this part of the world. And when the Pakistani policy community, which has, I don't like to call it specifically Pakistani policy community because it's the DNA of the society where it comes. I mean, you look at where the most of the martial forces in the Pakistan army comes, it comes from Punjab. And these Punjab, the Rajputana belt and everything, they have had a history of fighting for a very long time. The British, before that, the invaders, before that, all the way down to the Greeks, which essentially means that whether they recognize or not, their ideas on how to bargain with an empire, how to fight a war with an empire is very different. So I can talk a lot about how Pakistan, I can use the case study of Afghanistan war to basically explain how Pakistan fought the long war, recognizing the very fact that despite of American bombs and all, worth $25 million that eventually end up toppling over a $5 tent. Those understanding of past, when you realize it's very different, and that is where I believe that Pakistani foreign policy comes, that we bargain from a position of apparent weakness, which basically means that our understanding on strong and weak, our understanding on the temporal data on how to fight a war, how to get the maximum result out of it is very different. And I think the Afghanistan war, where for 20 years we were constantly labeled for playing a double game, terrorist sponsor nation, this and that. Anyone else would have probably just given way for whatever the Western world wanted. And yet the country, the policy community stood and took it till the end with the principled understanding that military solution was no solution. So if Pakistan would have just given up its own national interest for the short-term political interest of the Western powers, you wouldn't have survived as a country. So I think that's one very important element that is there. So if I use this context and this framework to then place it in the situation where recently there was a whole crisis on the Pakistan's visit to Russia and all. You see, since 1947, Pakistan had a very straightforward foreign policy. We were the best of the allies of the Western powers, specifically the US, and yet we had one of the most in-depth strategic partnership with China. So I don't understand when a lot of people in Pakistan make a noise about this whole thing that Pakistan have to do this or that. Pakistan's policy has been based on the fact that we will remain neutral. But the problem right now is that given the situation and how these sensitivities of the European powers are there, the expectation from Pakistan to somehow put our national interest aside and then to somehow some foreign war going on for the last centuries and be part of that by condemning, it's essentially coming out of that very colonial prejudice that us versus them, dividing the world in black and white, Putin bad, we good, this person bad. I don't think Pakistan subscribes to any of that. It's not that Pakistan does not condemn the crisis in Ukraine. Pakistan does all of that. The Prime Minister has been very crucial. The military has been very open about the fact that we stand against any military operation, we stand against any of these aggressions. But I think for the West to understand, and then for our own intellectuals to understand where Pakistan is coming from is missing. Because I think this is where Dr. Sayyid Hussain Nasser, who's at George Washington University, said something very important. We invited him for our webinar, and he said this thing about the intellectual elite in Pakistan, that the real problem that Pakistan is facing right now, that we have, he said that you have fifth-rate intellectuals in Pakistan that are more interested in activism in New York than being connected to the people on ground in Mia Channu and other places. And that disconnect from the intellectual elite in Pakistan is one of the big reasons why we're not able to understand our foreign policy. It's not that our foreign policy does not exist or our institutions don't exist. They do exist. Yet the issue is, when we're at good universities like LUMS, NUST, and elsewhere, our understanding and our knowledge production is so deeply intertwined with the Western theoretical frameworks and their understanding of us that we're kind of reinforcing a particular confirmation bias. And what we end up doing is thinking that Pakistan lacks the sense. Pakistan does not have the foreign policy. Pakistan does not have this. I actually don't think that any of that is true. What I do think is that there is a rent-seeking ruling elite, which has deliberately kept the absence and vacuum in the foreign and security policy, because then it allows them to undertake those strategic measures and strategic alliances which are beneficial for a particular institution or a particular elite, but which there is a huge cost associated for many millions and millions of people. And in this specific case, I think Pakistan has done a groundbreaking work, because this is for the first time actually, or maybe the second time, the first time probably when there was that neutrality on the Yemen crisis. But over here right now, again, Pakistan refusing to be part of this entire debate is, I think, something principally different in Pakistan, where both the civil and military have understood the fact that this is not how it's going to work. Now, a lot of this has been pushed by the recent events, because, I mean, the US has told us very openly that India is our preferred ally. We have nothing to do with you. So what is left to us in Pakistan is a change in the option. And the Russia account itself, I work very closely with the Russian counterparts and with the Russian academics and the policy community. It's not new. It was building up for the last 5-6 years. And only in the last 1 year, the ties with Russia have grown exponentially. And part of this, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, is driven by the SCO. If you look at, we did a very interesting study at G5IO. We took 2 hashtags. One was I stand with Putin, and the other one was we stand with Ukraine. And we did data analytics on these 2 hashtags, and it was absolutely interesting that the countries that were running the I stand with Putin were India, the highest, second Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, and China, SCO states. And the countries that were running we stand with Ukraine were the European and the former Western bloc.
Exactly.
So what's happened is that by default there's an East and West, but here is again our concern. And I agree with Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed 100% on that. And I think Pakistani foreign policy and policy community is very ruthless when it comes to these things. We never take any sides till the end. We were fighting a war in partnership with the Americans in Afghanistan, and we very well defended our interest on how we thought was there, despite the fact that we were called whatever. Again, this is the case with China as well, that Pakistan, despite having very close relations with China, strategic relations with China, everything there with China, yet Pakistan is never going to give up its autonomy and independence just because it's going to be part of a group. I don't think Pakistan does the group politics. It does message the Western world. I mean, the whole Russia trip was also a little bit messaging that, oh, we're going to join this group. But we like to, I mean, as a smaller and weaker power, what you're really left with is messaging. And then from those messaging and the diplomacy, that is where you have your play, because we can't fight big wars. We keep the wars small. And I also agree with Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed about the recent, this whole missile thing. And if you look at that, I mean, it's a very proud moment for Pakistan, actually. And I was very personally happy that despite our enmity, despite our wars and all of that, yet India and Pakistan have somehow been able to keep the wars small. And we have been able to negotiate, bargain at the military level, at the back end level, very effectively. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Europe and the Ukraine and the whole chaos, in India and Pakistan, I don't perceive that these two countries will ever go for a war for either a very long time. And they do have very solid mechanisms in place to be able to overcome any of these issues. I mean, you look at the Mumbai attack in 2008. You look at other several issues, the Samjhota Express, and now this missile crisis. My only concern is that if it was the other way around, the Indian media right now would have gone completely haywire, and we would have been the worst country in the world and sanctioned Pakistan, and all of that was there. But I do think that these sites are very promising. This new, I'm not going to say that it's a new emerging bloc, but I do think that there is a new emerging idea that this region in South Asia, and as very rightly pointed out by Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, India needs Pakistan and Pakistan needs India. There is absolutely no other way around it. The together potential of
Let me join there. That's my lifelong concern.
And just to add a little bit data on that, somebody was recently posted some Western diplomat posted this infographic where how 141 countries in the world are supporting the West and Ukraine. But if you look at the 5-6 countries that are not part of this war, those 5 countries are China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. These 4 countries together are literally half of the world's population. Correct. We are half of the world's population, which not just means population, it means consumption market, it means growth, it means competitiveness, it means a lot of things. And I do believe that there is a fundamental understanding within the policy community in Pakistan, and I'm sure in India as well, and as articulated by the Chief of Army Staff last year, that you need to grow together. There is no other way out of it. And this is where I personally think that the Western powers still continue to use the divide and rule formula in many ways. And there are interests of specific groups that want to continue the status quo. And I think with the policy discussions and all of that, there is a hope for a very strong ideological and connections based on real-term economics, real-term trade, and real-term connectivity, which the SCO framework might be able to provide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussain Nadeem, for explaining the foreign policy in a detailed way, but also within the larger context. I'm sure this has been really helpful for me, for the audience, and for kind of, bringing the conversation around. My final comments, I'd kind of like Dr. Taimur Malik Sahib to please give in, of course, about the conversation we're having about Pakistan's foreign policy. Our earlier panelists, they talked about messaging, they talked about stance, about neutrality, Pakistan's own national security interests. What is your assessment of that? And then I'd like that we open to questions.
One can't disagree with what's being said. Pakistan has to follow its national interests, and its national interests at the moment are in being neutral in this conflict. It's also important to understand that this is not something, as Dr. Hussain pointed out, that happened over the last year or 2 years. It started from 2004. It started with Pakistan's provisional membership, then full membership of SCO. It started with their foreign minister's visit to Pakistan in 2007, and President Zardari's visit in 2011, I believe, and so on. So there's been a progressive uplift in the relations between the two countries. What I would like to emphasize again is that we can no longer look at relations between nation states in geographic terms and in terms of local or regional arrangements. And as I pointed out earlier, the dependence on international economic, technological, and financial platforms, makes it crucial for you to understand how you're going to play around those things. So, we've seen recently that UAE has been placed on the FATF grey list, partly perhaps because of its geopolitical stance at the moment, or at least this is what's being said. Pakistan, having made so much progress against all the FATF 40+8 recommendations, is still on the grey list. So I think Pakistan is right to say that the Western philosophy of what is right and wrong, may not apply. We obviously and very clearly have to condemn any atrocities and crimes taking place in this conflict in Ukraine. As a civilized nation state, we cannot, side with any of that. But having said that, do we really need to be part of the conflict? We don't. But from a legal, lawfare, economic point of view, we have to consider that our trade with Russia at the moment stands at less than $300 million. Our trade with US alone is more than $3 billion. Our trade with Europe, UK, is even more significant. We have a GSP plus status. Our financial, global financial standing is based on our OECD and FATF type listings. So we have to consider how global lawfare and economic warfare is played out based on how politics plays out. So in that context, I think foreign policy making, or even if they're war gaming at the national war colleges in Pakistan and at the think tanks in Islamabad, it can't be devoid of an analysis of legal and financial instruments to which not just the state is party, but your larger corporations, your regulators are a party to. So how is State Bank of Pakistan dealing with a lot of these things? How are your large banks dealing with things? Are your consumers hooked to international apps, for example? Is your communication through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok these days? I mean, how reliant are you on things which can be powered off at the switch of a button, right? So, and maybe that's a lesson for us. That's a lesson for the rest of the world as well, that large countries at least need to perhaps start looking inwards as well, while we are looking at a global play. So I'm all for improving relations with our neighbors, but till our own, let's say, if we just talk about the technology platforms, till our own technology platforms are large enough and significant enough, do we want to happen to us in the case of India and Pakistan what the global technology players have done in the case of Russia? I would say no. I don't want to be held hostage to a neighboring country's technology platforms if we are too interconnected. If there is the same risk that we are seeing now in the case of the Western platforms and Russia. I think we have to learn from all of this, and I would just emphasize. So if you are studying international relations, you need to see how not just international law in the public international law sense that we are so used to seeing, but also in the private international law sense needs to be considered in terms of relationships between corporates and governments and so on. And also it's all about the economy at the end of the day, right? So we have to consider all of that in forming our national interest as we go about defining. So again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on this panel, and Mariam, for your excellent moderation as well.
Thank you, Taimur Malik Sahib. Unfortunately, Ahmed Bilal Sufi Sahib couldn't join us today. He was on a flight and that got delayed, and so he couldn't really connect with us today. And we'd have liked his insight, but I do think we were able to talk about international law in the crisis. So I think thank you very much to the three panelists that were here today for their very, very excellent insights and for an understanding that went beyond also this crisis. To try to understand what the political order looks like today and what are the different lenses and theories that we need to learn and use to better understand conflicts and relations between states like these. So really thank you for that. And I'd like now that audience, if they have any questions from either or all panelists, they could kind of let us know here. So from the auditorium there, I believe if the host could pass on to us any questions, and then also here that we have Zoom pay, participants could raise their hand and we'll take them in.
Right, so whoever wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. Right, you'll have to approach the camera.
Okay, thank you so much to all the panelists. It was really a judicious and enlightening session. So my question is specifically to Dr. Taimur. Sir, you have been to Hague Academy of International Law. अभी आपने बात की कि यूएन की जितनी बॉडीज हैं उनके पास अपनी कोई मिलिट्री नहीं होती to enforce their decision. So I just wanted to ask you, what good is, the international law? Can we say, is it just a tool for the powerful states to just subjugate the, mediocre and less powerful states?
I think if I can very quickly answer that, look, जब तक आपकी interdependence on a global scale नहीं थी with other nation states and global corporations, so maybe it was more of a challenge that international law was perhaps toothless, or you had to rely on foreign policy lobbying to ensure the desired outcomes. I think it's changing now. आप ये अगर FATF वाली grey listing या black listing वगैरह का देख लें, आप जो अगेन मैं ये कहूँगा कि जो उन्होंने मास्टर कार्ड, वीजा, एप्पल पे, फेसबुक, ट्विटर, लॉ फर्म्स, ऑडिट फर्म्स, सबको जो पुल आउट करने की बातें हैं फ्रॉम रशिया, दैट गोज टू शो कि आप इन्फोर्समेंट किस तरह कर सकते हैं. यू कैन डू इन्फोर्समेंट थ्रू टेक्नोलॉजिकल, फाइनेंशियल प्लेटफॉर्म्स because they are scared of the legal sanctions. So एक isolated nation state तो शायद वो कहेगी जी आप जो मर्जी कर लें इंटरनेशनल लॉ का, बट जो आपके कंट्रोल में कॉर्पोरेशन हैं, इंटरनेशनल रेगुलेटर्स हैं, they are scared of your legal enforcement. So and they can be your armies in enforcing and penalizing countries. So I think ये हो रहा है. So I think moving forward it's going to change. It's also sad because instead of moving towards a truly global environment, I think the recent issues, COVID se pehle shuru hua, but this recent conflict is going to force countries to look inwards and have at least minimum national capability in different sectors.
Thank you, sir. That makes sense.
Oh.
From here?
So first of all, thank you panelists and organizers for organizing such an amazing session. So I have a question and any panelist can answer. So my question is, what is the future of Russia and Ukraine conflict, and how and when will this conflict stop? And my second question is, what would be the position of Pakistan in future, and which situation would lead Pakistan to choose a particular side? So these are my questions.
Dr. Hussain, Nadeem, I think you are the specialist. आप respond करें. You would be the best because of Pakistan के perspective को अंदर से भी जानते हैं. So I think you are the right person.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. So the future of Ukraine-Russia crisis, frankly, I'm not an expert on European security issues and all of that, but I do understand some game theory on how warfare is conducted. I do also have, since last year, been very closely working with the Russian side. So I understand their concerns and causes as well of why this entire thing happened. From specifically, if you talk about the Russian perspective, you have achieved much of your military objectives, which was to neutralize the threats that you faced, also create a shock-like horror in Europe on what can happen in the future, so that those two messages have been very much inculcated down to the ground and to the global society as well. As far as what the Russia would want now is rather straightforward. I don't think you need too much science to understand that. A neutral Ukraine, free of Western inclinations, politics, militarization, and leanings. So they do want a neutral Ukraine, which I do believe that we will be very successfully be able to engage that. Part of the reason why I say is that because, again, there are two groups over here. One is the Europeans and the Americans. The Europeans are the direct victims of this war. The Americans are not. Americans have, they treat Europeans very differently. I mean, if you look at the discourse during the time of Trump administration in Europe, it was all about how the Europe needs to provide its own national security, net security safety. The US has subsidized the net security of Europe, which the Trump administration was very much against. Now, when you look at how the European countries are aiming to increase their defense spending, militarize, in case of the Germany, I do think that the Americans are kind of moving away from the assistance of Europe in this thing, so to focus on China more strategically, which is one of the reasons why European countries are coming together in against Russia. So I think what Putin is now trying to do essentially is play a divide and role between Europe and US. So he's talking to the peripheral European countries by talking to their leaders and trying to find a diplomatic solution and end to this, because again, I say, when the Afghanistan issue was happening in this, and there was a fall of Kabul, around 13 European different leaders, they came to Pakistan in a matter of few weeks. All of them with only one ask: please keep the refugees in your borders. They had no other issue, no women rights, no minorities, no girl education, nothing. And I've been privy to some of these conversations. There was just one thing that they wanted: keep the refugees in your country. We don't want any of them over here. So if you understand the European political dynamics, the inflow of refugees, while they're loving right now the Ukraine and all of this honeymoon period or the love affair will probably go down in the next few weeks and months. And then will come this whole idea that there are 4 million refugees circulating in Europe, and the amount of stress that it adds to the European economies. So I think for the Europe to end this conflict ASAP, even if it requires giving Putin a large bouquet, is what they're trying to do. So they do want to win on the information side of things and the narrative, but they do want to give major concessions to Putin. That is the story we are not hearing on the media right now, but that is the story that is actually happening in terms of the conversations between at the policy level. So I think Putin will get what he wants. The Europe will essentially get what it wants, and the Americans will get what it wants, and the Chinese will also get what it wants. For the Chinese, it's rather very simple. They've understood the playbook of how things will go when the Taiwan issue hits or the other issue hits. So they understand the exact dynamics of A, B, C, D, and the whole war campaign that will happen. So I do personally think that going by the math we've done, it will not prolong for more than 2 weeks. I'd be very, very surprised that it may go, because again, the European countries cannot afford a prolongation of this, neither can Russia. So 2 or more weeks, it will end within this March. The status quo will again be there until the next crisis broke out, because I don't think it's a permanent solution at all. Again, these are fundamental colonial era spillover configurations. We need to get over those configurations to come up with a new mentality, with a new framework of cooperation. Till as long as the European countries subscribe to a 14th, 15th century theoretical frameworks of war, politics, I think that will be a problem. Dr. Ishtiaq wants to say something.
Yeah, following what you are saying, one conclusion I would draw then from the arguments that have been presented is that if the Europeans have dominated the debate, decided its terms of references, isn't it time for Asia now to go its own way and creates its own framework, architecture of peace, not only in South Asia, but Asia as a whole? After all, we all have been brutalized by colonial interventions, haven't we? So that brings us together. And I would say regional cooperation is very important. Look at ASEAN countries. They have prospered a lot. I tell you, India-Pakistan territorial conflicts are one thing, but each of the members of this ASEAN community has territorial conflicts, but they decided never to go to war to resolve those conflicts. They do it through negotiations and so on. The same is the case with the African Association, which civilization did not go and treat them in a most inhuman manner. So that suffering brings them together. They have not insisted on redrawing of borders, although when the Europeans left Africa, they drew very arbitrary borders. The same tribes, the same village left on both sides. But not going to war is important for us, even in South Asia. As you rightly pointed out, and I'm very glad you made this point, there is some wisdom, 5,000 years old in our region. You look at Buddha, you look at the Bhakti movement, you look at the yogi movement, when Ranja gets fed up with organized society, he becomes a yogi, a Hindu yogi in protest. And that was possible. That shows how, blurred were these demarcations and the borders that we now draw. These borders, these things were drawn because of the European intervention in our societies. Bulle Shah, Bhagat Kabir, these people, the wisdom that we have here in this region is enormous. We don't have to run elsewhere to find inspiration, I think. We have to turn inside, and India, Pakistan are actually inseparable, I can tell you that. I don't buy this argument that we have any permanent disputes. These are all a product of the very arbitrary partition boundaries which were set up, for whatever reasons. Now is the time to overcome, to transcend those things, and Asia for Asians. Why not? Let's move in that direction, We don't want Western, chaperoning us what to do here, what to do there, when to vote here, when to vote there. I'm very pleased Pakistan took this position, despite all the, penalties that we are going to face. But that will actually enable us to stand up with a straight back, I think, rather than bowing all the way, begging for this favor or another favor. So I look upon Asia and its wisdom of the centuries being brought back to our advantage. It's time to recapture the initiative. I think this is how I would say is the purpose of this policy. This is the ultimate policy.
Dr. Ishtiaq is very right.
Piecemeal policies are nothing. The overall framework is important.
I agree with Dr. Ishtiaq, and you've hit right exactly to the spot, because this whole idea of understanding and developing an Eastern framework. I have a Zoom meeting with an Indian academic on Tuesday to figure out a way to develop a South Asian framework of international relations, because how we define the world, what terms we use, how we see the world, it's bizarre actually. I mean, if you look at this whole concept of how we're using, you see, the current international relations is Eurocentric, which basically means that the theories and the frameworks are developed on a European history, their experiences of war, their identity, their food and culture, their whole understanding of the world. And yet we take those theoretical frameworks, force them into South Asia, which, by the way, is at least 2000 years older civilization than rest of the entire Europe, and more civilized, more refined actually. And if you look at the place where we sit, I mean, for instance, right now I'm sitting in Islamabad. A lot of people over here in Pakistan don't know that this is where the Alexander's army was camped for not just few years. It was here. The Greco-Indian Empire was here for at least 700 years. What I'm trying to suggest, as which Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed has rightly pointed out, that our understanding of the world, the zero-sum game and ideas on cooperation are very different. And if you look at Buddha, and I've been very lucky and fortunate to have read a lot of the Eastern philosophy and mysticism. When he got his nirvana and the moksha, and he was traveling to different villages in the Uttar Pradesh and this part of the world, the kings would come out and they wouldn't ask to join him. They would put a pagadi utar ke, Buddha ke kadmon mein rakh ke, they would band after him कि यार हमने अपनी basically kingdoms जो है वो Buddhism के दे दी थी. That is how the Buddhist entire this entire kingdom was created in Texel and this part of the region. So you see, my point on that is that through our education, and I've been very fortunate, lucky to have been educated in the US and England and other places, but that education also comes with a flip side of things, because you are being continually bulldozed with Western definitions and understandings of right, left, black, white, terrorist, freedom fighter, this and this. And it is extremely hard for somebody who has studied abroad, been trained over there in academia, to then to then get over what you have been taught for. I mean, I'm not saying that it is wrong. What I'm saying is that when we continue to talk about this thing, कि ये जितनी political theory है, ये पाकिस्तान में क्यों नहीं चलती? पाकिस्तान की politics में नहीं चलती, is because those theories are not organic. A theoretical framework is supposed to be based on local data, local experiences, and local understanding. And over here, what we are a product of, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Ishtiaq, we are a product of a very, very ancient and sophisticated history. How the Mughals kept peace over here, how the Gupta Empire operated over here, and how the Chankiya was thinking at that time in Taxila. Unless and until we do not take the data of those eras and those civilizations, I do personally believe that we will continue to be living in a world where geopolitics is dominated not by our concerns or our understanding, but the concerns of the West, which then continue to force us to choose a particular camp or think in a particular way. I do believe that the reason, and I think that this is partly because it's codified in our DNA, that despite that two countries with nuclear weapons and whole armies with all the reasons to go for a war with each other, are yet both reluctant to go for a war. And that, I think, is a cue for us on where we want to take. And I do agree with ASEAN, reference to the ASEAN countries. If you look at what's happening right now in the past couple of years, one of the most important relations we've built with Pakistan, which a lot of people don't think is very important, but it is Uzbekistan. We have excellent relations with Uzbekistan. Their president was here with Tajikistan. This is part of that entire whole creating an Eastern way of understanding of things, the regional connectivity all the way to India, to Afghanistan and all of that. And I do think that if we are able to rightly intellectualize this thing in our discourse, I think that is the way where our people will probably understand how it will resolve a lot of our identity related problems that we continue to talk about, but it will also be actual beneficial for Pakistan in terms of the economic value. Because right now we've been fighting and we've been allying with countries all over the world, and yet this part of the world has been absent of any connectivity. So I do think that's very important.
I think Asia for Asia really does bring our conversation home in the sense of what we've been talking about in terms of Western news, information warfare, how to, kind of take that with a pinch of salt, and how to look within in its own national interests to kind of understand conflicts like these. So I think that was a good area where the conversation flew for the audience as well. I'm sure Taimur, Malik Sahib has to leave shortly, and we just have one question from Hussain Nadeem. Dr. Hussain Nadeem, aapke liye is pe aaya hua hai. So we're gonna take your brief comment on that, and then we'll wrap up. Doctor, yeah.
Sure. If I can be impolite and Dr. Ishtiaq and Dr. Hussain leave, because I have to be at another panel discussion starting now. Thank you, Mariam, and thank you, the organizers.
Thank you for taking out your time and for your insights.
Thank you.
The question to you, Dr. Hussain, is about the sanctions that are being imposed to Russia by the West, and who's benefiting from these sanctions, and if these sanctions are having any impact on Russia.
I'm not one of the best persons to answer the questions related to sanction, because this is international economy, and a lot of this subject is without data. There is no real term data on how much the Russian oligarchs are keeping and keeping their money in the black funds. So I don't think it's any answer to this. Anywhere you read, actually, I mean, in the Western world, you continue to see how sanctions are going to cripple Russia and all. I don't personally think that's true. From the Russian side, I continue to hear that sanctions are not a problem. That's not true either. Right now, the PayPal, the Visa cards, and all of those things have been in place, and the Apple has pulled out. Whether it hits the Russian economy or not, it will definitely hit the Russian people. So the sanctions will have a very catastrophic role on the Russian people that, by the way, for a very long time, do feel that they've been alienated from the rest of Europe and from the rest of the world. I mean, I've had a chance to have a lot of conversations with Russian friends around the world. And one of the fundamental problems that the Russian people have with their own government is the very fact that the government, they don't feel connected with the rest of the world. And through these mechanics of sanctions, Russia is going to be further isolated, which then increases the cost and pressure the Putin regime in being able to control and hold on to power, which is why it's very important for President Putin to pull off from this war in the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, while the Russian economy can sustain, because it's still getting the reserves from the oil and gas, but the soft economy side of things, an individual who's a freelancer sitting in Moscow who was earning some money through PayPal account, if that goes away, I think we're thinking of political crisis. I don't personally want to comment on specific numbers because I think that if the data on this is not completely out there, it's kind of useless to comment on that.
Fair enough. I think that wraps up our conversation today. Thank you so much, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed Sahib and Dr. Hussain Nadeem, for your very, very insightful conversation and input. And I'm very grateful for you for taking out the time. And of course, once again, to LUMS Policy Research Institute for organizing this. And I hope we can do more similar collaborative events like these that are helpful to the student body at LUMS in trying to connect with the academia and the policy circle that Dr. Hussain Nadeem earlier talked about in terms of the disconnect. So I think with that, we could kind of conclude the session. And once again, thank you everybody for being here and for listening and participating.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.
Really welcoming all of you when you come to Lahore, Pakistan.
Thank you.
Recording.